Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about cutting foam with a laser cutter. So when I originally did my Ortur Laser Master 2 Pro S2 video review, I cut a bunch of EVA foam with it and it worked really well. However, as some viewers pointed out, I didn't actually talk about the settings I used for cutting the foam. I did when I did the engraving part, but not the cutting part. So I thought I'd take it a step further, get out as many different types of foam as I had lying around, cut them all, and then tell you what settings I used. And hopefully that'll be helpful if you're doing the same thing with the same laser cutter as I am. Before we get into this, I always like to do a little safety talk to make sure no one gets hurt. All the standard disclaimers, make sure you do your research, don't believe anything I say, and make sure you have good eye protection that is rated for the laser you're using. Make sure it's quality and not just maybe what came free with your laser, and make sure you're not breathing in any fumes. Whatever it takes to not do that, make sure you have it sorted. I've read lots of different things about cutting EVA foam and the fumes. Some people say it's not safe, other places say it is safe. So at the very, very least, I would say make sure you have excellent ventilation and run it through a filter so that you're not spewing stuff outside if you're venting outside, and just make sure you're not breathing it. And if there's any doubt, then don't do it. It's not worth risking your own health to make a pretty swirly rectangle. And that being said, let's make some swirly rectangles. The last time you saw my laser cutter, it was in my garage, but it's now the middle of winter, so I've brought it downstairs. You'll see I've got it hooked up to my super sweet homemade air filter, which then travels up and out through our bathroom fan exhaust pipe. I just 3D printed some fittings for the hose so I can unhook the exhaust pipe and hook it up to the laser cutter. Super loud air compressor, which I want to replace sometime with a smaller air pump, and that connects to the air assist hose going into the machine. Originally, I had a piece of plywood as my cutting base, but it just adds to the smoky smell, so I've put down some ceramic tiles to replace it. That should give me a fairly flat surface that isn't too affected by the laser. Now it's time to scrounge up some scraps from the magical drawer of foam. I found a pretty wide range of foam from 2mm to 11mm. I imported a swirly design into Lightburn, which is the software I'm using to do my cutting, but before I start cutting my actual pattern, I need to get a really good idea of what settings I need to use. And that's where the material test feature of Lightburn is pretty great. Basically, it lets you set up a test cut with varying speeds and powers so you can find the right combination for the material you're using. I'm going to keep my test grid quite small with 2 rows going from 600 to 1200 millimeters per minute and 5 columns going from 10 to 60% power. You'll notice you can also go into the material setting and control the number of passes it'll make. For this starting point, I'm just going to do 1 pass. Then I can check out the preview, which will show me exactly what's going to happen when I start my laser. Now when I press the frame button, the laser moves into position and outlines the cutting area. I can reposition my foam so the test cut will be where I want it. Tape it down so it doesn't move, close it up, make sure everything's safe, and press start. And a couple minutes later, when it's done cutting, you should have some little boxes. The result you're looking for is a grid with some boxes intact and some boxes not intact. So from this test cut, I would say I could either cut at 600 millimeters a minute at 35% power, or 1200 millimeters a minute at just over 60% power, so maybe 65%. Well, let's try that. I'm going to cut the swirl at 1200 millimeters a minute at 65% power with 1 pass. Meep mop meep, laser laser laser. And there we go. You can see the air assist has blown some things around, but it doesn't seem to have caused any problems. Considering I'm able to separate the parts using only 1 hand, I would say that's a pretty successful cut. That was 2mm thick What the Foam from Cosplay Apprentice, which is a high density foam. Now let's try some regular run-of-the-mill craft foam from a local craft store. It's yellow. You can see that it needs much less power to cut through than the denser What the Foam. Interestingly, as you can see here on the final swirly piece, the edges are super clean. There's no black soot or anything on them. They're just clean yellow. That's pretty cool. Now the last 2mm thick foam I'm going to try is a piece of white craft foam. And this is another interesting result because it hardly cut through. And it kind of makes sense because the lasers are made out of light and the color white reflects all of the visual spectrum of light. So yeah, probably don't cut white with this type of laser. It's just not going to work very well. Okay, my next thickest foam is 4mm What the Foam. Since this is a much denser foam, I slowed down the speed parameter on the test cut and increased the top power to 100%. It cut incredibly well at 600mm a minute at 75% power. Here's a 6mm thick medium density foam. This is the stuff I use for my costumes all the time that I get in a big roll. I had good results cutting out the swirly piece at 600mm a minute at 50% power. And here's some 6mm thick What the Foam in the shape of a foot, because I tried using it in some boots for extra insulation. We see the difference here that the density of What the Foam makes on the cut. It's the same thickness as the last piece of foam, but even at 100% power, none of the cuts made it through. I did another test cut, but this time reducing the lowest speed to 300mm a minute, and at 100% power, the laser finally made it through. The cut worked alright at those settings, but if I had more shoe bottom to work with, I think I'd also like to try it at a higher speed with a couple of passes instead. Next is a 10mm thick pink puzzle piece floor mat. Interesting here, looking at the back, you can see that as the laser cut goes deeper and deeper, it gets wider and wider. This would be, I think, because we're getting past the point where the laser is optimally focused. I ended up cutting that piece out at 600mm a minute at 90% power. Interestingly, I had the exact same floor mats just in the color blue, and even though I used the same test settings, none of them cut through properly. I tried again, this time using 2 passes, and that made a huge difference. You can actually see there's a little line where the first cut made it to and then the second one finished. Alright, now we're on to our thickest piece of foam, which is sitting right around 11mm. Do a test cut, and it looks like 600mm a minute at 100% is just not quite enough, so I decided to slow it down to 500mm a minute at 100%. Unfortunately, when I made the cut, this is what happened. The obvious thing is the foam moved during cutting, which is not super helpful. But beyond that, the cut looks really rough and not very nice. I didn't have any more foam that thickness, and I didn't have enough space for another test cut, so I just kinda took a guess and used 600mm a minute at 60% power, but this time with 2 passes instead of 1. And that seemed to work alright. It cut all the way through, and it gave me a lot cleaner edges. And that's it. That's all the foam I had. Alright, well that's a lot of swirly rectangles I made. I'm sure they'll come in useful never, but they look kinda cool. I hope this video gave you a little more comprehensive look at some of the settings that work for cutting foam, maybe some that don't. Obviously, no matter what you're cutting, if you're cutting a new material, you're gonna have to do a material test and figure out what settings you need to use, because even with these 2 foams, they're exactly the same, but because one's blue and one's red, one cuts better than the other. And I guess that's because the laser, I think, is blue light, and so then if you're trying to cut something blue, it would be reflecting a lot of the blue light, and so you'd need more of it to cut it, maybe? I'm thinking something like that, perhaps. I'm not a physicist. Also, just to remember, I have the 10-watt laser head on my laser, so if you're using a weaker laser, then your power settings would definitely have to be a bit different, I think. Hey, if you are interested in stuff, you should check out my Lost Wax 2 channel. That's where I do all the stuff that I do that's not costume related. Like, I have some footage for how I made the filter for this laser cutter, and if I ever get around to editing it, that'll go on Lost Wax 2. So make sure you go subscribe and watch and do all the things YouTube watchers do when they go on a YouTube channel. Alright, thanks for watching. See ya. Full disclosure, I did receive the Ortur Laser Master 2 Pro S2 from Ortur for free. They didn't pay me anything, but just so you know. And I do have an affiliate link in the description below, which you can click, and that will affiliate me some money if you end up buying one. So that would be great, but you know, don't feel pressured.